welcome to The Art of Being Human. In the last few segments, I've been talking about the physical body and how it influences our behavior and our feelings and everything about us. And I'm not trying to make physiologist of you, but I find that it's a very interesting study, and what I really want to do is to help you get a sense of how important the body is and how we respond to it and what happens to us in terms of our personality in relation to what's happening in our physical system. And so in that line, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about marijuana for just a second. This isn't anything I have any notes on, but I know that there is a push in this state to legalize marijuana for recreational use. And you know, once that marijuana is legalized for medical use, then you know it's going to be legalized at some point for recreational use. And a lot of people say that marijuana is no worse than alcohol. Maybe it's no worse than alcohol. It may be different from alcohol. But I think before was too happy about the fact that this bill is in the process of being passed. If it has been passed, I'm not sure whether it has or not. Before you start to take any drug that can influence you psychologically, you need to know what it's going to do to you. And so for the people who are interested in using marijuana as a recreational that kind of thing, you need to know what marijuana does to you. Go into it eyes wide open. And what marijuana does is it depresses the brain. It slows the brain up. And the person who is using marijuana will find that they're introspective, they're thinking about their thoughts and their feelings, and actually what they're starting to do is to disengage from the outside world. And I'm not saying disengage completely. It's not like they're hallucinating. It's not like they're drunk. But they're so into themselves, and their brain is so slowed, and the reaction time is so slowed that they're not behaving in a normal kind of way. Now, there was a man who was driving, and he was using marijuana, and he said, and he was interested in the thoughts and feelings he had while he was driving under the influence. And what happened was he thought he was floating in his car. He had the sensation that his car was like 2 to 3 feet off the road, and he was just floating down the street. And that wouldn't make him a better driver. It wouldn't increase his reaction time. If anything happened to him, if there was an emergency, a car pulled out ahead of him suddenly, his reaction time would probably be slowed because marijuana slows the brain, depresses the brain, and I can't imagine anybody being a safe driver on it. Although technically maybe not drunk, that doesn't mean a person is safe. And there's another thing to consider too. If you're using marijuana, especially teenagers, supposing a teenager is using marijuana and they're about 15 years old, they have 10 years before their brain is mature, because the brain does not mature until about mid-20s. So the person has got a good 10 years of maturity where the brain is developing and growing. And it's been shown that marijuana and other drugs, I'm assuming, will depress and change and slow down and impair the rate of growth and maturity for anyone whose brain is still growing. And so that's another consideration. So I'm a little nervous about people using marijuana, thinking that it's a safe drug. There's no such thing as a real safe drug. And starting to drive with it, having the brain depressed to the point where it's not going to be able to react fast in an emergency, having the thought processes so ingrained within you that you're not quite sure if what's happening outside, or not able to react to it quickly. You know, I did take a student, when I was a college professor, I took a student off LSD. He was using it and he was getting hallucinations, and his mother brought him in. Now, generally speaking, all I did was work with college students because I was a college professor. But this woman came to me and asked me to see her son who was using drugs, especially LSD. I don't think it's used that much anymore, but anyway, he was using it. So I told him to come in and I would work with him some, and I told her, don't be surprised at anything that I say to him. Because the one thing I'm not going to say is don't use drugs. Because as soon as you say don't do it, someone's going to do it. No one's going to tell me what to do. I'm going to do what I want. So if someone tells me not to do drugs, the first thing I'm going to do is drugs. Now, I didn't have her in with the boy. I saw him separately. And what I said to him was, I can't tell you not to use drugs because that's got to be your choice. It's not going to be my choice, and I'm not going to be with you to stop you if you do. But if you do decide to use LSD, at least look at what it's going to do to your system. Understand what it'll do to your brain before you start, so you go into it wide-eyed and not go into it and thinking, well, I wished I knew that before this happened. So what happens with LSD, I mean, he was open to that. So what happens with LSD, and I got all my physiology books out and all of that, is that the chemical structure of LSD is very similar to some of the neurotransmitters of the brain. Very, very similar. So if a person is taking LSD, the brain is reacting to it like it was a normal hormone in the brain, and it's not. It's something that has been ingested from the outside. But the brain's going to react like it's one of its own chemicals, and it's going to react like it thinks it's supposed to that. And so you have, as a result, hallucinatory experiences. Now, a hallucinatory experience, for all practical purposes, is a hallucination, but it's a little bit different because it's not from within the brain that it has started. It started because of a chemical influence from outside of the brain and ingested into the system, confusing the brain and tricking it into doing something that normally it wouldn't do. So you can really hurt yourself, you can injure yourself, you can have hallucinations that don't leave. I've known of people, kids particularly, that jump out of trees because they think they can fly like Superman when they're on LSD. LSD is just a chemical that's to be stayed away from because you can get very serious injury and brain damage from it. There are some people who think they're in the inside and they can't crawl outside of their bodies, and therefore they end up in mental hospitals, some of them for the rest of their lives. Now, I don't know how much LSD is being used now, but you have to remember there is an interplay between what you take into your system, even foods, even herbs, which is why I say if you're going to use natural herbs for healing, go to somebody who knows what they're doing. Go to somebody that's trained in it, because you can get reactions from natural herbs just like you can from medications that you're allergic to or drugs that you put in your system. So it's important to understand the interaction between you as a human being and your physical body and what is happening to it, either because you've taken something, whether it's prescription, non-prescription, herbal, or drugs, and what it is doing naturally because it is not working right, it's out of sync. And some of those things get confused together and it's hard to distinguish them. So this is just kind of a word of warning. And as I said before, I'm not trying to make you into physiologists, but I want you to get the interplay. I want you to understand the interplay between the human system and what is put into it. And you as a person and that has a personality and how you react to that. I know I watched a show once where, this is a few years ago, where a woman said, unless I get marijuana, I will die. She was suffering from cancer and somehow had the idea that marijuana would cure her. Now, maybe it would take away her pain, but I thought to myself, she's deluding herself, because marijuana isn't anything that the body produces naturally. It's not anything that you have that you need in order to live. You know, you won't live if you don't have food and water. You won't live if you don't have some of the hormones that you need. And I'm thinking particularly of insulin as a diabetic. But you have to have certain things to live, but marijuana is not one of those things. And so if you ingest something that's not natural to the system, you take a risk, and you play, to a certain degree, Russian roulette with what's going on in your system. So it's very complicated, and you just have to realize realize that. But today I really want to go into glands, and I have a sketch here, and then I'm going to go into the glands and what they do. When we finish with this section on physiology, I'm going to talk about, and it won't be this segment, and it may be a little bit, maybe we'll start next segment, all of the physical illnesses that you can get because your body isn't reacting right, because your brain chemicals are out of order, or something's wrong physically in your system, and how that affects you psychologically. Because a lot of these illnesses that you get because you don't have homeostasis within the body or a balance within the body will react in terms of your personality, in terms of what you are like as a person. And I think that's important. Psychologists have to deal with it. Doctors have to deal with it. The individuals who are ill have to deal with it as well. And it is a pretty interesting study. But let's go to the glands. I have here a little chart that I drew that shows the major glands of the body. It doesn't show all of them, but it shows the major endocrine glands of the body. So here we go with that. In the brain, this is the brain, of course, and this is the cortex of the brain. You have the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, and there are some books that list the hypothalamus as also a gland. There are other books that do not do that. Excuse me, it depends upon what you're reading and what they believe. So we know that in the brain we have the pituitary, which is the master gland, the pineal gland, which is important, and the hypothalamus, which may or may not be considered a gland, but some books do consider it, and it's in that general area. Then you have the thyroid gland, which is around the larynx. It looks a little bit like a butterfly shape, and within the thyroid gland, you have 4 or 5 parathyroid glands. They're very, very tiny. Now, what's interesting about the parathyroids, they're so tiny that each gland is only the size of a grain of rice. That's all, just a grain of rice. And sometimes the thyroid has to be removed for medical reasons. So if a doctor is operating, they have to be careful because without knowing it, they may take out the parathyroids with a thyroid because they are so thymy. Then you have a thymus gland, which is really behind the breastbone and kind of in front of the larynx, and we'll get into that. The thymus is not functional for all of your life, but basically from being a child up through teenage years, this is a diaphragm. That's just how I drew it. Then you have the adrenal glands, which are on top of the kidneys. Notice I didn't draw the stomach. I didn't draw the lungs. The top part of the body is off, so you can see the glands underneath. This is the pancreas, which is like behind the stomach. And then you have the ovaries in the female and the testes in the male, which produce estrogen in the female and eggs, and the sperm in the male, and also the sexual, what's called the sexual secondary characteristics. So what I want to do now is discuss endocrinology, and I'm going to have to remove this, but I may just put it back up. Endocrinology is the study of glands. Let me get this up so it'll be easier for you to read. Endocrinology is the study of the glands. If you have any kind of a problem with your thyroid or whatever, diabetes or anything that involves the glands at all, you are seeing an endocrinologist as your medical specialist. And the endocrinologist will monitor what's happening with the endocrine glands and what they do. And you may have some illnesses that are related to something gone wrong. The glands are called endocrine glands, and they secrete substances, and these substances are called hormones, and many of them are ductless. They don't have a duct to them, and they secrete right into the bloodstream. So here are the glands that would be included: the pineal, pituitary, thyroid, the parathyroids, the pancreas, the testes, the ovaries, the thymus, and the hypothalamus, if it's listed as a gland. So those are the main ones. And you can have up to 35 hormones to 40 hormones. Here again, depending upon what kind of text you read and what kind of research has been done, you have, let's say, approximately 40 hormones that are circulating in your blood system at all times. It gets to be pretty interesting. So the glands, another thing that's interesting is that the endocrine glands, ductless glands, they, as I said before, they put substances into the bloodstream, 30 to 40 hormones. They regulate growth, development, pregnancy, birth, metabolism, personality. They regulate a lot. You know, the brain is the main sense organ of the body. Without the brain, we wouldn't even know that we exist. However, the brain doesn't do it alone. The neurotransmitters, the nervous system, the glandular system, what's circulating in the blood, all play major parts of who you are, which is why I'm so adamant about being sure what you know, what you're putting into your system, because it's not all that difficult to get things out of balance. And the glands will coordinate with one another. Too little or too much of any neurotransmitter or any glandular substance, any hormone, can give you a lot of trouble, a lot of medical trouble. And the secretion of one hormone, if it's too much or too little, will increase or change the nature of what's secreted from other glands, because they work together, they coordinate together. And if you have one gland out of balance, then it's going to affect the rate at which other glands secrete their own hormones. It's a very, very complicated system, but it's also fascinating to know about. So I'm just going to kind of review with you the highlights of it. Let's take a look at the glands. The adrenal glands, and as you know, they're on top of the kidneys. There are two of them. They're 2 to 3 inches long, and they each weigh less than 1 ounce. And yet at the same time, they secrete approximately 35 hormones. They deal with kidney function, response to stress. They release adrenaline and noradrenaline as their hormones, as some of the main hormones. There are others, of course. I'm not listing them because I don't think you want a list of all 35. They convert protein into energy. They accelerate the heart rate. So if you're under stress and your heart is pumping fast because of that, the adrenals are partly responsible for that. They deal with blood pressure. They secrete androgens in men, estrogen in women, but of course the ovaries do too. This is just a second source of sex hormones being produced. And they deal with the sympathetic nervous system. All of that from a little gland that's only weighs less than 1 ounce. You stop to think of the immense power that these glands have in the body and the tiny size of them. It truly is remarkable. Well, let's take a look at the hypothalamus. It is in the brain, and it links the endocrine system with the nervous system. It does that. It controls involuntary functions. It deals with temperature, hunger, thirst, and fatigue, all of that. And that's not such a big area of the brain either. The pineal gland, that's also deep within the center of the brain, it secretes melatonin for waking and sleep cycles. The fact that you can wake up when you're asleep, the fact that you can go to sleep to begin with. We say, oh, I'm tired, I need to sleep. What causes you to wake up? Well, it's going to be these glands. The pineal gland works with that. The pituitary gland is located in the brain. It's the size of a pea. You know, the parathyroids are the size of a grain of rice, but the pituitary gland is only the size of a small pea. So that gives you a chance to understand how tiny it really is. It's considered to be the master gland. It regulates all of the other glands. It has an influence on the other gland, which is why it's called the master gland. It regulates growth. It causes contractions. If a woman is going into labor to deliver a baby, it causes the contractions of labor. It controls milk production in pregnancy. Too much will give you giantism because it also controls growth. There's a growth hormone there and it controls growth. Too much will make a person a giant, and too little will make a person a dwarf. Now, I will do the parathyroids and then we'll close with that because we're starting to run out of time. The parathyroids, as I said before, are embedded in the thyroid. Each is the size of a grain of rice. It regulates calcium levels in the blood. That's critically important because without that, the nerves will not be able to fire electrical impulses so you can move and talk and breathe and all of that. So it's very, very important. The amount of calcium in the blood, and the little parathyroids do that. It allows for electrical activity of the nerves and it contracts the muscles. Now, we have just a short time left, so I'm going to stop right here and I'm going to continue next time with the rest of the glands and then make some comments about the brain that's important in terms of how it develops and what we can expect of children at certain ages because of the development of the brain and how mental illness really gets started. So I'll close it here and we'll continue with this next time. Please join me then.